Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our second part of our Celebration Nonprofit series. I'm Chad Koulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber. We do our event in partnership with Hamline University. Wish we could be at Hamline today like we were last year, but this is a great format to do when we need it. And Jeannie, would you like to just say a quick welcome?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Jeannie Fox, Hamline University, and I'm thrilled about today's topic. Kari and John do a lot to support the nonprofit sector here, and I'm particularly interested in hearing how COVID has changed that landscape.
Great. And we have our title sponsor joining us today. They have been our title sponsor for a few years for this event. They are a staple in the Midway community. And one thing I always like to remember about Episcopal homes is that when you look at all the housing that's on University Avenue, that trend really began with Episcopal homes. They were the first housing development on University Avenue in decades, and that's a real accomplishment. And I was able to attend their annual meeting on Monday to get a little bit more background on all the work that they're doing. And it's one thing talking to Marvin or Mary or somebody on their staff about what they're doing, but it's totally another thing to actually see the video and see firsthand what the work really is. So they're a great partner of ours. They're a great asset to the Midway. Marvin, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Chad, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, please. So for those of you that aren't that familiar, just remember that our main campus is at University and Fairview. We have been here for 126 years. We are serving at any one time about 850 elders. And in a year, we serve about 1,400 elders. We also, though, have a child care center. And also not housed within our 10 communities, we have a home care company called Neighbor Care. You might have seen the vehicle driving around in your neighborhood or by your place of business. So certainly you have seen some of the horror stories in the news about long-term care. And I want you to know that it doesn't apply to us. I'm delighted to say that. That at this time, as we speak right now, in one of our 10 communities, we have 2 active cases at this time. And those 2 cases, in the situation there, those 2 residents are in our secured, enclosed, dedicated COVID unit. Our other 9 communities do not have any cases. And so because of that, as you know, some long-term care organizations have had hundreds of cases, and that never has been us. So we're delighted. And one of the key reasons is because of the way our communities are designed. It's much easier to create barriers and adequately implement the infection control techniques that are really necessary at this time. Another thing you need to know about long-term care is that life hasn't stopped. All right, enriching life and building community is what our mission is, and it continues. Now, we have certainly had to make some modifications because there's always the balance between the physical safety and fully living. And so we can't isolate, and at the same time, we have to be very cautious about how we proceed. So we have no large gatherings, but we certainly do have some small gatherings, and we orchestrate them carefully so that people can be socially distant and that people are wearing masks. And we do a great deal of activities and life enrichment and education, et cetera, online. So while it would have only been, 9 months ago that our elders would have said, no way am I going to get my life enrichment activities through a computer. Well, they've changed, they've adapted, and certainly our management staff and our frontline staff, they've adapted. So there's a great deal that's happening through the television screen, through the computer. And so life enrichment does continue. Community does continue. And then lastly, because of COVID, you're going to hear from John and others about how life has changed in the nonprofit world. Well, one of the ways that it has changed for us is that certainly the public has gotten frightened of long-term care organizations, and for obvious reasons. And as a result, we are in a rare situation where we actually have some openings. We have some openings in assisted living. We have some openings in long-term care. Our home care company, of course, is always welcoming of more customers out in the community. And we have some openings in childcare. And so we are, like I said, I mean, if you had asked me a year ago, you know, I'd like to get my aunt, my neighbor, my mother, whomever, to come to your campus, we might have said, okay, here's who to call. And that person would have said, okay, it's probably going to be 3 or 4 years. And that's not the case right now. We have some openings right now. So just letting you know, not only are we open for business, right? We're fully enriching life. And yes, there's opportunities. All of us know someone that likely isn't far away from needing the services that we provide, the kind of community that we have and embrace every day. So think about us. And right now, it's a rare situation of where we actually have some openings. Good to see you all.
Thank you, thank you, Marvin. And some people here know that there's a pub that's over at Episcopal Homes for the residents, named after a former Midway Chamber Executive Director, Ellen Waters Pub. And it's going to be quite the celebration when you guys can open that up again. So look forward to when that can happen. Well, today we thought of an important topic would be just to talk about what is going on in the nonprofit community. And there has been survey work done by the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. So you can hear firsthand from them what they have learned from other nonprofits throughout the state of Minnesota. Find out the good, find out the bad, find out the struggles, and see that you're not alone, first of all, in what you're dealing with either. So we are joined today by Kari Onestad and by John Pratt. You may remember seeing John at our Celebration Nonprofits event a few years ago. He was our luncheon speaker. So at this point, I welcome John and Kari.
Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Okay. Well, sorry, Chad and colleagues. It is great to be a part of this. And Chad, yes, I got to speak, I think about 6 years ago at the Celebration of Nonprofits, and made a point about nonprofits in the Midway area. And the Midway area is sort of this amazing wonder spot for nonprofits that historically many organizations have located on the University Avenue sort of neighborhood because of its accessibility to the state capitol and to city Minneapolis. And there are a number of these wonder spots around the world where people have sort of created tourist destinations. We would like to create the Midway area as our nonprofit destination area. We mapped where our nonprofits located here, and you can see this is sort of the historic nonprofit Main Street where so many organizations are located. And so we also do sort of annual surveys of what's happening to nonprofits, what's happening in the nonprofit economy. Minnesota tends to rank at or near the top of almost every measure of charitable activity. Before the whole COVID-19 situation, Minnesota's nonprofit sector was at an all-time high, employing more than 390,000 people and making up 14% of the state's workforce. Each year we produce a nonprofit economy report. And this year we have additional information breaking it down by age and sex of nonprofit employees. Probably no surprise to anyone on this call, 75% of nonprofit employees are female, 25% male, sort of a very different picture than the business or government sectors. Collectively, these organizations generated $89 billion in annual income. A big part of that is in health-related organizations. So when we report this information, we report it both with hospitals, health organizations, and universities, and sort of the non-hospital, non-higher education nonprofit sector. Overall, there's 9,190 nonprofit employers. and this has continued to grow. So this is about 14% of the state's workforce. And there's no right number of nonprofits to have or right number of nonprofit employees, but this is part of a healthy sort of information and service-based economy. We've done 3 impact surveys, including looking at what's the effects on employment, on sort of closures. We know about 20% of the workforce continue to work from home. We identified sort of 4 key themes of what's occurring to nonprofits. Certainly back in March started the epic uncertainty of how long will it last? When can we return to work? What will happen to our revenues? The financial crisis hit immediately, sort of catastrophic revenue loss, which hurt many organizations, especially initially arts organizations, and that's probably been the deepest financial effect. Also health and education. Some of the jobs returned, but overall, it's still a huge recession for the nonprofit sector. It exacerbated a lot of the issues around racial inequity. And after the murder of George Floyd on May 28th by Minneapolis police, that sort of added an additional crisis. And we saw that on University Avenue as well as in Minneapolis. And then it really was a challenge to the nonprofit role, sort of what are the appropriate services and activities for your organization in this new situation. Some of the questions we've gotten are, well, how has this affected different types of nonprofits? So we initiated, we've now completed 3 surveys of nonprofit organizations with over 1,000 responses, looking at what particularly happened to organizations. If we think about sort of this, how does a crisis hit a sector of the economy? It's not unlike how crises hit sort of whole societies or populations. This is a popular chart from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, part of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. Crises go through different stages and sort of both before the disaster, the immediate impact, and then sort of people's response. So we saw the immediate response was pretty spectacular. There were organizations that reported that they had a task force to work on telehealth for 3 years. And basically in 3 days after the shutdown, they figured it out and began delivering services. When I mentioned the story before, I got an email, someone said, well, we did it in 2 days. So there was a very quick response. The PPP loans had a huge benefit and helped people get through that early spring and summer situation. There's still the question of what happens from here. So there was a heroic and immediate reaction. The total number of, there's a response from Minnesota funders, a disaster recovery fund, which was useful. And the state of Minnesota in its grant making became more flexible, and the city of St. Paul initiated several different responses. One of the big problems that this raised, both the George Floyd killing, but also just the larger reckoning with racial injustice, we saw how organizations sort of began addressing how does racism affect the people they serve in different parts of the nonprofit sector. And we saw this really every activity area: criminal justice system, police accountability, housing, employment, education have been reckoning of what needs to be done differently and how can we address issues, longstanding issues that need sort of more concerted, and what people are looking for is not just conversation, but actual changes. We also, in our survey, we asked people sort of what are the main issues affecting nonprofits. and you can see them here. And I guess this would be a question to people on this call is, what would you add to this list? Clearly, reckoning with systemic racism, economic recession, workforce stress. It's been very difficult for everyone in this situation, but the employees of organizations are asked to do different and often more. We have been sort of in this COVID-19 suspend mode where we're still in this altered state. And then what does that mean for return? In some of the recent news, I mean, good news about a vaccine with promising results, bad news about the numbers for a large part of the country, including Minnesota, going in exactly the wrong direction. And then yesterday with the new highest death toll is really, it's discouraging, and it puts off that much further. When do we return to sort of in-person activities? A big question hanging out there is the state budget. We know that there'll be a deficit that can be addressed at least this time with the state budget reserve, which is a good thing that the state did set funds aside. But then next year, we're looking at another state budget deficit in a situation where revenues are decreased across the board. We saw a special situation with the IRS making mistakes and erroneously revoking organizations' tax exempt status that we've been working with Minnesota's congressional delegation to address, and also some of the congressional committees. The election consequences for much of it, it looks like there's not, in Minnesota, not substantial change. There's still hope at the federal level that there could be a CARES Act too, that the PPP was very helpful. Many people believe that we need sort of another stimulus action. So this isn't so much directly addressing unemployment, it is stimulating the economy and getting money into the hands of people and money into the hands of employers, and that was very helpful. So I'm going to turn it over to Kari to talk more about what we've learned in these surveys.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am Kari Anisad. I'm the Director of Advancement for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. So I get to do all sorts of things related to research, like we're talking about today, fundraising, et cetera. So as Chad and John had mentioned, we, beginning shortly after the COVID-19 impacts were becoming clear in mid-March, started responsibly surveying Minnesota's nonprofit sector. And thank you, I'm sure, to many of you who have been participating in those surveys, helping not only us get a better understanding of what the impacts are of the field, but then be able to in turn digest that feedback and share it with the broader field for sake of learning and sharing like we are doing today. So this information, I'm going to be summarizing trends across the past 3 surveys. So we did one in late April, we did another one in July, and then this most recent one came at the end of September. So this chart that you're seeing is from the most recent results, which is late September. And overall, there's kind of good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news so that we can end with good news. So overall, reported levels of disruption remain high. So yellow, green, and purple is all folks reporting some level of disruption, and that's 90% that you're seeing. That's been consistent across the past 3 surveys, but the silver linings or the good news is that yellow slice is some disruption, but manageable. So that piece of the pie has been getting bigger over the course of the 3 surveys. So in May, kind of 99% of people had reported some level of disruption, and 80 said that it was significant, and only 18% had said that it was manageable, but now it's 43%. So we're seeing that organizations are finding a way to adapt to current conditions. And I'm sure this is true of all of you here, that nonprofit organizations are many times led by smart, amazing leaders who can do a lot in extreme situations. Some other silver linings in the most recent survey, 7% said that they're currently in financial distress, and half said that they're about to get there in 9 months. So they're not yet, many of the organizations who responded indicated they're not yet in financial distress, but it could be coming soon. The results from July had predicted that the fall would be difficult for many organizations, but only 3 organizations in this most recent survey reported ceasing operations. In the second survey, it had only been 14. So we haven't seen yet sort of this mass closure of organizations that I think people have been bracing for. It has not yet happened. So we've also been asking kind of what are the ways that COVID-19 has been impacting your organization? And this, what we see is kind of almost 75% of organizations have reported increased demand for services, and an unfortunate tension between also that same amount or more reporting a decreased ability to provide services. This has been a consistent theme across the surveys. Nonprofit organizations can play a crucial role in Minnesota's public health system, provides essential community services from a variety of activity areas. So when something big happens that impacts communities, it makes sense then the demand for services from nonprofit organizations would see a rise. And so this is part of a case that we've been trying to make and have been making and supporting you all in making your case for funding, that kind of the combination of demand for services and operational challenges, loss of funding in certain pockets have decreased the ability to provide. So how important it is to continue to make sure you all have the resources you need to succeed in your charitable missions. So the next 2 slides are kind of a graph that just dictates some common themes that we saw. So what have been the impacts specifically that you've experienced, and then what have some responses been that nonprofit organizations have been leading with. So obviously immediately the shutdown order and closed altered facilities that happened in early May. We saw kind of restrictions be introduced again by Governor Walz this past week. So as many of you have named in the chat, that kind of continues to pose significant operational challenges around the delivery of programming and services, the move to virtual as we're all gathered on Zoom today. John mentioned earlier kind of the sudden catastrophic revenue loss. So in response, a lot of organizations have seen kind of increased fundraising efforts. They've had to figure out how to reduce budgets. The CARES Act, in particular, Paycheck Protection Program loans have played a crucial role in, I think, supporting the sustainability in this interim time. So we haven't seen the closures necessarily that we were bracing for, likely due in large part to the Band-Aid or the booster of the PPP loans. So a couple of quotes from the survey that I think are helpful. So one person wrote, DHS has halted our ability to do most in-person services for individuals with an IDD, and that we serve our day in employment services. We continue to try to build remote services, but DHS won't pay for remote services for about 70% of the people we serve. So that's hindering us greatly. We're using PPP funds to do what we can before we run out. We are government funded program fee for service. We have no revenues coming in if we can't provide a service. So we asked in our second survey about PPP loans. 78% of folks reported that they had applied and received a loan. So a significant chunk of the respondents had said, yes, we went for them and we received them. No one applied and didn't receive them, at least in our survey. And the total amount ended up being an estimated equivalent to about 14% of an organization's annual operating budget. So when combing through the data that was made available from the Small Business Administration, we saw that 5,300 Minnesota nonprofit organizations ended up making use of a PPP loan. A couple of other impacts and responses, obviously health precautions. One nonprofit had reported that in March alone, their monthly expenses doubled due to this combination of increased expense with needing to purchase more personal protective equipment, but then the loss of income from reimbursements as the ratios have had to be lowered. They're not able to bill for as many services. And then they also had to start implementing hazard pay for some employees. So just this kind of combination of revenue loss and increased expenses that's really hit some groups hard. We've obviously seen that employees don't work just as employees. We live in bubbles that have lives behind us. And so we've had a workforce that's been impacted by school closures. Folks have been getting sick or have had family members who have been sick. Obviously in Minnesota, we've been impacted by the events following the murder of George Floyd, civil uprising. Many of this might have been happening in our neighborhoods or to our organizations directly. And so not discounting or underplaying the importance of paying attention to how trauma and pandemic fatigue can impact human beings. So we've seen also that there's impacts on funding sources in terms of our grants and contracts that we may have. So those grant proposals and contracts were written probably most of the time in an era where we didn't have these same operational challenges that we're facing today. And so we're seeing a lot of folks have to go back to original funding sources and kind of renegotiate the terms of those contracts to kind of lighten up what the deliverables are, or kind of readjust what the expectations are given the new condition. And then finally, kind of the 50% coverage of direct reimbursers liability. There was a little bit of an issue that our public policy team continues to look at, that some nonprofit organizations can choose to not participate in the state unemployment insurance program, but do have kind of their own program. And that left some groups vulnerable when unemployment started kind of spiking. So what have folks been doing? We asked not only about the impacts, but also kind of how are you actively managing as you're adapting to all of these impacts and changes around you? The most common response was that folks have had to re-project revenue, even doing kind of monthly or in some cases bi-weekly looks at income and expenses and try to do forecasting as much as possible. Scenario planning, consultation with the board. Many folks have had to augment or reduce programming and cut down on a budget. We also saw responses around kind of additional strategic work, information gathering, processing, sharing, all on top of keeping the business going. So lots of stress and strategic work, particularly landing on nonprofit executive leaders, senior leadership teams, and boards. So not just trying to take apart the airplane, build it while you're flying, and also trying to figure out where you're going on the radar. There's a lot all happening at once. So we asked about top concerns. So what, as you look to the future of 2021 and currently, what's the outlook for your organization and the communities that you serve? Kind of capacity to do the work and continue to keep doing the work was the most commonly cited thing, which is tied both to staff morale and the loss of funding. So it was sort of connected to both of those other points that you see on this slide. The biggest loss of funding was reported in donations from individuals. About a fifth of folks have reported losing money from their individual donor pool. Only 18% saw drops in foundation and corporation giving, and 17% from fee for services. There's also kind of a concern around how do we continue to support the communities who are most impacted by the work. And again, kind of hearkening back to that earlier slide about increased demand for services is continuing to grow. We also asked folks, so what are the top 3 issues or opportunities that you see facing the state of Minnesota in the next 3 years? So not just looking at your organization, not even looking at the community most impacted by your organization's work, but for the whole state of Minnesota and looking for the next 3 years, what do you think are going to be the top 3 things? Health and public health, access to care, COVID-19 was cited as kind of the top concern, followed by a close second of equity. And this was also tied to racial equity, systemic racism, real strong calls from the community about needing to tackle this work and no longer kind of have it continue to persist. Some concern about adequate funding for community services. Earlier, John had mentioned with the forecast of the state budget, who, at the time when the survey was completed, the presidential winner was unknown. And so there was concern about kind of federal sources of funding. So making sure that nonprofit organizations have adequate levels of support and able to continue to deliver the services that the community relies on. All right, so what are some key ways that MCN continues to advocate and support the nonprofit sector? So we continue to and will be looking forward to engaging in proactive public policy and advocacy. So paying attention to making sure that nonprofit organizations are included in any future federal relief initiatives. Our public policy team at Minnesota Budget Project, in partnership with some key partners throughout the state, have been working on an Invest in Minnesota campaign. So making sure that as we're grappling with a state budget facing a deficit, that cuts to key sources of funding for nonprofit organizations that impact communities don't happen. As you're seeing today, we've been doing some responsive research and developing resources. So focused on employment trends, tracking those unemployment numbers for the sector, looking at organizational status. We just released our 2020 salary and benefits survey. So this is a biannual report that we issue that maps out key trends in compensation. And for the first time, we will be able to look at compensation and benefits of nonprofit executive leaders through a couple of different lenses. So race and ethnicity, gender identity, geography, budget size of an organization, and are excited to bring on a temporary research person to support our work with that. We also offer Benefits MN. So this is a nonprofit, I was gonna say state association health plan that kind of leverages the collective bargaining power of the sector by going into one health plan together. Enrollment, if you all are interested, you have to be an MCN member, but enrollment will open up shortly. If not now, I might have to defer to John on that. But it's a great benefit, and folks have experienced incredible cost savings in participating in that work. Continue to work on racial equity, and then some recent attention to kind of grant processes and funding accessibility. So I'll talk more in a little bit about an upcoming event in January that we're looking forward to, that's building off of what used to be our annual Minnesota Foundations event, but now expanding to include state grant-making agencies. It's going to be very exciting. And I will turn it back to John.
Okay, my resolution for this year is to unmute. I want to share information about a memorandum. MCN was asked to be part of a drafting group to send a message to the presidential campaigns after the election. Ended up, we've 2 days ago sent this to the Biden-Harris transition team on behalf of a whole group of nonprofits, including independent sector, and Minnesota Council of Nonprofits was asked to be a part of that. And the message is basically wanting greater recognition and connection between the federal government and nonprofits. There has been sort of episodically over time. And I will, Chad, I will send this to you that you could share with others right after this call. But it has several points. One, looking for presidential leadership, having a staff person with direct access to the president with responsibility and similar staffing to other relevant federal agencies. And I think most of us are familiar with the role of the Small Business Administration. Actually, one of the most exciting parts of the CARES Act was that there was sort of full recognition of the importance of nonprofits as employers. So this was really the first major economic stimulus program that included nonprofits on equal footing with other employers. So we want to see more of that on behalf of the nonprofit sector, to bring policy knowledge about the nonprofit sector into the White House. This was an issue 10 years ago with the Affordable Care Act, where decisions were made that affected nonprofits as employers, where they didn't take into account nonprofits sort of interact with the IRS in different ways than for-profit businesses. To have prioritized investment and job creation, including nonprofits, and to make this a permanent connection. And there are several ways to do that, and they'll be laid out in this memo, but basically having a White House office and liaison structure. There's several alternatives, ways this could be structured. A permanent interagency council, sort of this is how the federal government structures things. And then also a cabinet level agency. The Small Business Administration at different times has been considered a cabinet level agency. We would like to see the same thing for the nonprofit sector. And one good analogy for what would be a useful support is the Small Business Assistance Centers, which are sort of this national network that provides support to small businesses. And certainly we want small businesses to succeed. In the same way, we want to see nonprofits succeed. This is good for the economy, good for employment, and certainly good for the quality of life in our communities. So I'll share that with you, Chad, and you can share that with the people on the call. And then Kari's going to talk a little bit about some upcoming events.
All right, wanted to make sure that you all are aware of 3 key events. Obviously, there's a lot more other events that MCN has going on, but wanted to lift up these 3 in particular. So our annual conference will be virtual this year, alongside many other virtual conferences that have been converted. So we're excited to offer the annual conference December 8th and 10th. Which will be offered on a virtual platform. The theme this year is persistence through re-evolution. So the kind of focus of the whole conference has been about centering and lifting up voices from the Black community, Indigenous community, and other people of color. Our whole planning committee has been comprised of folks who identify as BIPOC individuals, and the content for all the breakout sessions and keynotes speakers will be featuring kind of content in that way. So encourage you all to check out the breakout sessions are now live on the website, and you can take a closer look at what's in store for 2 days of learning and convening with other nonprofit leaders. We also have session lineup coming up that will be offered in 2 dates in January, one focused on the kind of metro area, and then another event focused more on greater Minnesota. So for those of you who don't know, this is an annual event that MCN offers. It's an opportunity for folks to get a chance to hear from incoming representatives about the issues that they're going to be focused on in the next year, and then get a chance to ask questions. And then also our 2021 Minnesota Grantmakers event and directory. So for 20 plus years, we've been producing an annual grants directory that features over 100 of the top Minnesota grant-making foundations. It's a unique resource. The directory itself is available, arguably the most cost-effective prospect research tool for nonprofit organizations. It's potentially free for members using a voucher, or available for a price under $100, which compared to a lot of the databases, that's pretty dang good. So it comes out timed with an annual event that used to be called Minnesota Foundations. We now are calling it Grantmakers because it's no longer featuring just foundations. So we will be talking to a handful of state grant-making agencies. So think Department of Human Services, Employment and Economic Development, Health, Education, Department of Transportation, to get a better understanding of what are the funding opportunities that they see could be available in the next year, and what's some key information that nonprofit leaders should know about. So it's a great event, 4 hours long, features a panel of professionals who have made calls to foundations and state offices and asked some key questions. Fast-paced information sharing will also take place on Zoom, where you have the benefit of getting intel from everyone else who's attending through the chat. So we're really looking forward to that event and hope that you can join us if you're interested.
Thank you, Kari and John. We've got some questions on here on the chat, and feel free, everybody, to continue asking questions. Can you expand a little bit on the lack of the ability to do in-person events and what that's going to mean for nonprofits going forward?
Well, I think that has been the huge adaptation, and it really has varied by activity area of, it depends what you do. There have been some organizations that actually made the sort of the pivot to remote interaction, relatively unscathed, that they could continue their work as it was, and on a huge continuum all the way to, say, performing arts, where they can perform some remotely, but their whole almost reason for being was to bring people together and have a more personal experience. So, I mean, that we've, in the survey reports, we tried to share information about what have the coping strategies been. And certainly telehealth is sort of one classic example. But I would encourage people sort of through the chat too to share sort of what have they done themselves. The stories about sort of interacting with, the intersection of providing services and getting reimbursement from state or county agencies, that's been some of the sore spots. There has been a lot greater flexibility on the part of funders, but that doesn't solve the problem for in all situations. So it is, this part is very tough, and that's where the PPP loans really, it was everyone could participate in that if you had employees, but it's this adjusting to sort of remote delivery is sort of a very uneven playing field.
I see Heath's question in particular about the impact on fundraising events that, you think about galas or the in-person meetings where you're reliant on that human interaction to be able to build relationships or of trust. It's an interesting thing. I've been thinking about what are the COVID innovations. So the adoption of telehealth being one. I heard somebody describe COVID as almost being the tide that's receded and laid bare the inequities that's always been there. And so with that, you're forced to look and see, wow, the world actually hasn't been working well for a lot of people. And we have to make changes because the way we've been doing things in a lot of cases doesn't work for the current moment. And so with fundraising in particular, you saw kind of some inequities in that as a microcosm of this bigger trend. So bigger nonprofit organizations that have the administrative infrastructure to support professional grant seeking, major gifts, planned giving, ended up kind of having a concentration of resources. So wealthy donors giving a lot of times to wealthier nonprofit or bigger nonprofit organizations. So the field in response, I think you're starting to see some really creative adaptations around fundraising. In particular, Vule, the thought leader, for those of you who know, writes a blog called Nonprofit AF, has been a part of a coalition building and launching something called community-centric fundraising. And so it's really a combination of grassroots fundraising, mutual aid support, power building within communities. So a movement to try to support and encourage nonprofit organizations who want to kind of strengthen their fundraising in this remote COVID environment, but it maybe challenges some of what has been historically considered best practices. So an opportunity for change, a COVID innovation perhaps that may end up serving everyone better in the end. This is the hope for when you have windows of disruption, that you have better things in the end.
Well, and I'm reminded of our speaker last week, Glenn, who said the worst thing a nonprofit can do right now is to do nothing. So, it's really important, even if you can't do those events in person, find a way to reach your donors. Don't take a year off. If you have an annual ask coming up, make sure you do something and be in front of them. So Mary McEwen from Keystone asks, She's interested in learning how the federal CARES includes specific support for nonprofit infrastructure needs. Much of the CARES funding is for immediate help and things, but very little to improve the infrastructure so we have resources for the COVID recovery period. Your thoughts?
That's true. And, you know, I was talking with the head of Minnesota's unemployment services, because there was a big part of the stimulus was aimed at both individuals, sort of the $1,200 checks, and also the $600 boost on unemployment. But that was aimed at sort of helping the economy, not specifically addressing sort of the COVID-19 direct impacts. There's more hope for sort of phase two, that there will be a phase two. Of course, we have this gridlock now at the national level, so it's we can't even agree who the president is coming up, so that of course we can't agree on sort of a next phase of a congressional bill to deal with sort of that current situation. But that's definitely been part of the mix, and certainly, you know, part of our role is to get the word out about what are funding opportunities. One of our most popular for MCN Zoom calls was one we did with Propel nonprofits on how to apply for PPP loans. And Minnesota actually was one of the most successful states for nonprofits in getting access to those funds.
And I see that Kari has now included a link that is a helpful chart on showing the different CARES Acts. Good. And Jeannie has the question here about what are you hearing from nonprofits in greater Minnesota? Are these challenges affecting them differently or the same? And I also had a similar question of, what are you noticing the difference between larger and smaller nonprofits too?
Well, and that was that last question. There was a difficult part of the CARES Act is that it cut off after 500 employees. So the largest nonprofits actually couldn't take advantage of the CARES Act funding. And we worked with several groups in the congressional delegation to try to address that. But that 500 cutoff is the definition of a small business under the Small Business Administration funding guidelines. So that was hard to solve. It was interesting, we have 6 regional chapters around the state with regional coordinators, and they organize their own meetings in different parts of Minnesota. They've seen a great increase in participation, and sort of an ironic effect of sort of these stay-at-home orders and people working remotely is all of a sudden greater Minnesota nonprofits have equal access to a lot of the conversations and discussions and deliberations because everyone's using Zoom or something. And I should also say MCN has a 20% discount on Zoom subscription. So, so that's been sort of a positive development. So they've seen a definite ramp up in participation and networking and connection. But I think the funding issues and the drops in contributions, they're definitely feeling the same challenge.
I'll add that particularly in the earlier surveys, COVID wasn't quite present in the greater Minnesota regions yet. It was really kind of concentrated on Twin Cities Metro. And so as COVID has started to spread to more rural communities, we're starting to see more impacts, but it's almost like the impact, it's been shocks of a wave or something that are rippling out. And now we're starting to see folks reporting that.
Another question from Jeannie, what have been the impacts to membership organizations like Council Nonprofits and Midway Chamber?
Well, I'll speak for MCN. We saw what turned out to be a delay in March and April when people weren't necessarily receiving their renewal notices. And so we saw a drop off, but it turned out to be temporary. And so we're back up to sort of our regular numbers. So MCN has 2,200 nonprofit members who pay dues across the state, and the dues go from $50 up to $1,600. So that's recovered. A big part of our model too is in-person events. And that is seen sort of the biggest challenge, including that actually organizing remote conferences can actually take more staff time than in-person events, and require more producers to be sort of engaged. How about for the Midway Chamber? And I should say MCN is a proud member of the Midway Chamber.
Yes, we're proud members of each other's organizations. You know, for us, we similar, there's been a drop off, and it's been difficult for some to pay. You know, we have so many different industries within the chambers, so some it's a lot easier than others right now. And when we have a member that says that they are going to have difficulty paying, we try to work with them. We try to figure out if there is a different situation, a payment plan that they can go under, because we don't want to lose any members because they feel like they can't afford it. It's harder, of course, to reach members when we can't do much in person, but we've had to adapt like everybody else, as you're seeing here on the Zoom call. So we've been able to make the changes to our organization to still operate. And, you know, John, to your point about it, sometimes it's harder to do an event virtually. There's also, of course, a lot less costs, generally speaking, because you're not having to rent rooms, you're not having to pay for food. It's easier for people to attend when they can just open up their computer and boom, they're there. They don't have to travel anywhere. So, you know, there's good and bad on that. It's different, it's difficult, and we miss seeing everybody in person.
It's a funny feeling to have 10,000 square feet at University in Raymond. That carpet is not getting worn out at all.
Yeah, a lot fewer copiers are made in the copier machine, and yeah, everything. So, well, and that brings me to a question on trends with working from home. Everybody, or a lot of us, have made that adjustment. A lot of nonprofits certainly have. You know, some nonprofits, like our title sponsor today, Episcopal Homes, they have to be there in person because they have residents who are there, and they have to work with them in person a lot of times. But have you seen any trends from your discussions with nonprofits? Are they planning on continuing to work from home forever, or are they going to have a lot more staff working from home than they did in the past? What are they planning post-pandemic?
This is another one where it varies by activity area, but actually we've seen, actually with our own landlord has lost 2 nonprofit tenants who decided to go permanently remote. And so I think it's still sort of shaking out what's happening. And there's a difference between, you know, how long is your lease to what options you have.
Mm-hmm.
Kari, can you think of other things we've heard?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm thinking through all of the like anecdotal narrative responses and all the surveys and member conversations. Folks continue to be in adaptation and crisis, that I think the future planning has really been focused on how long are we in this? What's it going to be? What's the next phase? Sorry, I have a dog. So I think employee remote work is maybe a part of future scenario planning, but I think in the context of the other bigger questions that they're grappling with in terms of strategic planning and future budgeting is maybe not top of list. But I agree with John that I think it varies by activity area and the activities of the organization.
And I see that Mary McEwen has a comment here about being on a call recently with 30 nonprofit leaders. And a big issue is that staff burnout, anxiety regarding the increase of positive cases. And have you, either of you, talked to any nonprofits who are really experiencing that firsthand, where they maybe are seeing a lot of their staff either have major concerns about getting it or are getting it themselves, and there's an issue of staffing ability?
Can I actually jump in on that, Chad? Because I found Mary's comment really interesting because I was in a faculty meeting yesterday at Hamlin University, and one of the faculty used that exact same phrase, pastoral care. Certainly there's education going on, but particularly with the undergraduate, younger, students, the level of anxiety around just existing and coping in this era is difficult. And so I think nonprofit leaders of all kinds are being asked to support their staff, their constituents on a much more personal and emotional level. And so I wonder about the implications for our staff and leaders that way too.
Yeah, and what are the tools in the toolbox? I know some organizations have said, okay, we're gonna close down the organization for a week, just to give people a psychological break. But thinking, what are the other ways that you can do pastoral care? And then that varies too. Of Episcopal homes can't close down for a week.
Mm-hmm. If I remember right, there was a stat in your survey, 40% of the nonprofits were really concerned about their future and if they could sustain. Do you think that has changed throughout the course of the pandemic? Have people gotten either more optimistic or less optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, partly there was so many unknowns of how do we even do this? Well, people have been doing it now for 7 months. So I think, that piece is clear. Hearing about more of the recent cancellations, including today, the Vikings saying none of our games will have in-person fans. People are realizing, so much of 2021 is going to be more of the same. So we don't know what the return is. And so it's that piece that as people are deciding on their 2021 budgets, sort of making some sacrifices. I know there are organizations that PPP got them through 2020 in decent enough shape. It's 2021 that there are a lot more planned deficits.
Mm-hmm. Then Mary has a comment here from Episcopal Homes. We at Episcopal Homes cannot close down, but like fast adaptation to technology, we similarly need fast adaptations to support staff, uplift them, support their families, etc. I'm looking forward to learning in this space as we move through these next phases of managing. Right. All right. Is there any last questions or comments we have from anybody?
I just would like to give a big public thanks to both the Midway Chamber and the Council of Nonprofits, showing the importance of we need organizations at that level to support those on the ground. And both of you do that in a way almost behind the scenes on some issues. So thank you both, hang in there. And thanks, Chad, for making these networking opportunities available.
Absolutely, and these are recorded, and we know people do watch them afterward and share with their boards and their coworkers. So it lives on after this. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to not only our title sponsor, Episcopal Homes, we have our supporting sponsors, Riverland Bank and Mendoza Law Office. And we're taking a couple weeks off in the series, but we're going to be back on December 3rd, and we've got a few more that we're going to have in December. So thank you for joining us, and have a good day.
Good to see everybody.